I'm Safia Usmani, and you're watching another episode of the Fulbright Women Podcast Season 1, where we bring to you the brightest women of Pakistan who are doing some amazing work in their fields. Today we have with us Farah Nadeem. As a single mother and a woman of color in STEM, Farah didn't really have many people around her who she could say looked like her. In her time at the University of Washington as a Fulbright scholar doing PhD in electrical and computer engineering, Farah came across a skill that was missing from her life so far, the skill of advocacy. The ability to advocate for yourself, for your community, or the communities you serve, particularly those who are underrepresented, can help create a path of success and influence and inspiration for many. Farah is here today with us to share her experience, insights, and strategies when it comes to representation and advocacy.
Hello.
Hi Farah, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm good. Finally, we're able to do this after coordination of weeks. So I'm just happy and excited for our conversation today.
Me too.
Perfect. Farah, I kind of want to start our conversation with a quote I just read recently. And I think that's a perfect fit to begin this conversation. It's by Nancy Grace Roman, and she's known as the mother of the Hubble telescope, as you may know. It says, I'm going to read it. I still remember asking my high school guidance teacher to take a second year of algebra instead of a fifth year of Latin. She looked down her nose at me and sneered, "What lady would take mathematics instead of Latin?" You're a woman of color, and a single mother. What is it like to be a woman of color and all of that in STEM?
So I love the fact that you started with that quote. I think that really does sum up a lot of my experiences. So I'm going to start with undergrad. I went into electrical engineering, and at that point, women made up maybe 10% of our cohort. And we had a lot of, both implicit and explicit messaging from, our peers, our professors, telling us we don't really belong here. An interesting sort of manifestation was that was my first internship. So I show up, I just completed the first year of college. I talked to the manager and, he tells me, well, you're going to be doing this, this, and this. And then he pauses and he looks at me and he says, we used to have a washroom for women and one for men, but there were no women in the office if we converted both washrooms to those for men. And I looked at him and he said, there is a building next door. They have a washroom for women. The internship lasted 4 weeks. It was a very, very long 4 weeks for me. And I think that is sort of true for the experiences that I had, where you realize that, this place is not really set up to accommodate you. So moving forward, I went through undergrad, I did some work, and then I went back to grad school. At that point, I started teaching as well. So the interesting thing I noticed was that it's more acceptable for you to be a teacher in STEM if you're a woman than it does for you to be a professional in the industry. And that I found was a very interesting segue into the next stage where I went into teaching and research. And then when, I was doing grad school, I was a single parent at that point. And a question that sort of came up on, a few occasions was, STEM needs a lot of commitment. You need to be able to work very long hours. If you're a primary caregiver, can you make that commitment? And sort of, I always felt this burden of proof where, I have to go in and prove my worth and make people believe and demonstrate then that I'm as competent as my other peers. So that's sort of been my journey. But the good thing is that over time, from when I graduated in 2008, till today, I do see things changing. It's always heartening, even small changes, they're just good to see in this regard.
Did you ever come across or find yourself in an exchange or a conversation that you found uncomfortable?
So there have been a few. One actually does stick out. So I was facilitating, I believe, a coding session for kids. And this was when I was a grad student, and we were a community of student parents. And this person comes up to me. He is also he was a med student. And he says, this is interesting. I said, yes, so coding is a basic competency. It'd be great if kids have access to this, especially girls. And he looks at me and says, what do you do? And I said, I'm a grad student in engineering. And then he opens up a conversation saying, biologically, women are not made for STEM careers. And then he proceeds to explain to me why, there is so much evidence as to why, women are not made for coding and STEM careers in general. And, I'm trying to give him examples and sort of counter arguments. There's research that shows that none of it is true. And then, I changed sort of my tactic and I said, well, because you have a very diverse population, if your technical teams are diverse and inclusive, then your products are also going to serve the population better. And he looks at me and then he names a community in a developing country. And he said, this community, I worked with them a lot and I understand them really well. So I can design things for them without having them be on my team. And at this point, I've sort of lost for words. And then, he proceeds to conclude the conversation and the sentence begins, I think women can be. And I'm waiting for the punchline here. And so, but at that point, there's a person who's been listening in and, for the last 15 minutes of this conversation, and she jumps in and she says, women can be rock stars. So women can be anything they want. And the person who's been educating me for the past 40 minutes looks at the two of us and he decides that this conversation is over. And it was a very interesting experience because, this person came out and said all of those things, which very few people, in my opinion, have said. But I do think that this thinking is common and you catch glimpses of it here and there. And the way people frame comments about, the lack of women in the technical workforce. So the burden of that comes to, well, women don't like this, or women are not made to do this, as opposed to we are creating an environment which makes women uncomfortable enough that they don't want to be a part of this.
Exactly. So that makes me wonder, I was reading up on it and I learned that only 28% of, the STEM force is of women, and if you go in women of color, that is even, the percentage is even far lower. That is one thing to, talk about statistics. And another thing to be in that world and experiencing that. Like you mentioned this anecdote of not having a loop for yourself and having to go to another, building to access a washroom, right? And then the socialization, the whole community. Can you talk about those experiences a little more? Elaborate on that. What is it like to just be an only woman standing in a room that is just dominated by men?
So I think that's a very important point. And, this doesn't happen at any one particular point. So there is, research that shows that by the time children are in middle school, they have some ideas about what they're going to do with their career. And we're socialized and we're given a lot of implicit messaging that shows us, where people who look like us belong. And really, for a person like me, I see very few people like me in STEM, and that's been true when I was growing up. And that does play a very important role. So, you go through this pipeline where, people are telling you belong here, you don't belong in these technical careers, but then let's say that you do end up in this career. And there have been a lot of times when I've been the only woman in a room full of men, and I'm trying to make my point. And it's just, you have, like I said, the burden of proof is always there, that you have to prove that what you were saying is worth listening to. And the messaging that you get, that you've gotten all your life, also, it just doesn't impact women, it impacts everybody. So in everybody's mind, you have, as if you're a woman, you have to prove your worth to be taken seriously. And that can be, that can range from, extremely unsettling and uncomfortable to downright comical, really depending on where you are in terms of your own self-confidence. And that's always a challenge. And, with time, in a good scenario, with time you grow confident in your own abilities and you're able to counter those arguments. But it is always, I've always found it challenging that my gender, speaks before I do.
Yeah, it demands somehow the society demands again, here as well, more from the women than the men, right? This reminds me of another study, and I want to read it verbatim to you. It mentioned that teachers were predominantly women, often have math anxiety. They pass on to girls, and they often grade girls harder for the same work and assume girls need to work harder to achieve the same level as boys. Do you agree with that? What has been your observation?
So I would agree with that. And it's very interesting that not only teachers pass this on, but there is a lot of messaging again that girls do internalize. So there's also research that shows that when girls get to high school, their confidence in taking math or science does drop. So I think going back to your initial comment, one, they're not encouraged to, and two, they're made to feel that they're inadequate when it comes to this. And really interestingly enough, there has been a study at Stanford that looked at sort of starting pay of STEM professionals. And one of the things they found was that STEM professionals who go into an interview and are very confident tend to get hired at higher salaries. And of course, just putting it out there, the self-confidence does not equal competence. And girls just tend to be less confident. And then, so this also, interesting enough, is translating into a starting pay difference as well.
You highly believe in representation and advocacy, which we'll come on to later on. But in terms of representation, what role do you think not having enough female role models in STEM has to play in girls trying to choose their, majors and careers?
I think it plays a massive, massive role. Again, that implicit messaging we have it really influences young adults. It influences children, the choices that they make. So if I, growing up, cannot see anybody who I can identify with in some way in the profession that I want to go into, I form an opinion that this is not for me. And this is true for a lot of people. So women, even people of color. Even now, if you go to a Google image search and you type in engineer, you are going to predominantly see white and Asian men, right? So there are going to be far fewer women in those pictures, far fewer, let's say, Hispanic people or Black people. And that messaging is very much out there. And if we have more role models, right? If you have, women of color that, students can relate to, I think that's going to make a huge difference. There's an interesting work that I did as part of my dissertation research. And I just looked at, pulling out gendered mentions in textbooks. So these were open source K-12 textbooks. And I said, all right, so let's pull out all the gendered mention. And I just did, at a very simple level, a comparison of, female or feminine mentions compared to masculine mentions. And it turns out across the board, feminine mentions were half as likely to occur as masculine mentions, right? So that shows that even the textbooks that you're reading talk a lot more about male characters than they do about female characters. And predominantly these were STEM textbooks. So I think representation in our content in real life, in just media, I think that matters a lot.
That's correct. I was reading another study, and it was basically talking about representation and confidence in all of it, because it's a complex system we're talking about that affects you in multiple ways, right? So they were talking about how women are when you're in school, women are expected to take biology, because they're gonna go out and become doctors, especially in Pakistan, right? We hear that a lot. But eventually, what happens is women end up taking lower tier roles in medicine, and men tend to have roles that are paying them better, or that have more value in terms of the hierarchy of the society or whatever, right? So I was reading that as well, and that made me think, and it goes across the board, the gender pay gap in STEM. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So the pay gap exists across the board, right? And I'll tell you anecdotally, I very recently was having a conversation. There was a member of my technical team who happens to be a woman, and I spoke out this person needs to get a pay increment because this is not a par with everybody else. And the person I was talking to articulates this, that, well, this person would have a spouse who's earning money, so maybe she doesn't need as much. And a few decades ago, this was actually the premise for a legal pay gap, right? But it still exists, and it exists in full force. And again, when it comes to STEM, you have these the lack of confidence, which ties into women not negotiating for higher salaries. You have just the generic assumption about competence, perceived competence, and which all ties into this pay gap. And it is, it comes to a point where you have to advocate for yourself, and then you realize, well, I also have to advocate for myself for X, Y, and Z, and this is just one more thing to tag onto it. And for some people, it's not worth that conversation anymore.
That's right. So I'm sure you think about this a lot more, because you're in this industry. How can we reduce the STEM gap?
So I think this is something we really need to actively work on. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So one, starting salaries in STEM are higher, right? So women should have access to that opportunity. And then, because STEM professionals are designing products and solutions for a very diverse population, they will always benefit from a diverse workforce. And I think the way to do that is really look at the entire pipeline, right? How do we encourage young children to pick up basic STEM competencies? How do we engage them in STEM activities? So, all of people who are considered minorities, so there may be women, there may be ethnic minorities, and we start really young, right? We start at the end of primary school, we start in middle school, and we engage with them, like introduce role models so they can, I've been part of programs where I would go out and talk to fifth graders about what it's like being a STEM professional. And part of that was, yes, an information session, but part of that was also representation. And that needs to happen across K-12. But beyond that, we really need to actively mentor young women when it comes to college, when it comes to career. And I've been fortunate enough where I've known some incredible women who have been doing this, who are doing this, and especially when it comes to, let's say, faculty positions in STEM. And representation there is, again, a big challenge. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done there. So it needs active mentorship, active allyship. And I heard a comment about this, which was really stuck with me. And again, one of these incredible women made this comment that said, if you have a problem with your pipeline, you don't blame the water. And I said, that is really where we need to start with this.
You said we have to start with younger kids, right? In schools, with the curriculum, with the kind of attitude they're developing, the confidence building and all of that. And I feel like this is the perfect time to segue into what you're currently doing. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So I'm currently working with the government in public sector education. So this is K-10 education predominantly. And what I do, because I'm a technical resource, I look at data for public education in the province. I look at student level data, school level data. And then that data eventually is used downstream for policymaking, for implementation, for monitoring of different initiatives that the government is working on. And in that sphere, I make it a point to break down data so we can look at gender disaggregated numbers. Now, there has been a narrative that in our public schools in Punjab, the percentage of girls and boys has reached quite a decent level of parity, which on the face of it is very good information. But when I broke it down level wise, like what's happening at the primary school level, what's happening in middle school, what's happening in high school, you realize that girls are still more likely to drop out as they move through to higher levels of education, right? And that is something that I have, worked on, I've flagged. And I think this is one of those pieces where we need to be very careful in aggregating things and not really looking at our different demographics. So that's part of the work that I do. And I really think that it's important for us to always keep the perspective of different demographics in mind, because not everybody is starting from a level playing field.
So, why are girls dropping out of schools way more than boys?
So that is a very complex question. And if you look at the research and if you look at anecdotally, you're going to find a whole array of answers. And one of them really does tend to be society's attitudes towards girls' education. In Pakistan, unfortunately, there's still people who believe that girls are not meant to have a high level of education, to even get professional qualification. Then there is, access to education, right? If you belong to a lower socioeconomic strata, you may not have access to a higher level school. Transportation may be an issue. Security may be an issue. And then there is just access to basic wash facilities, so water, sanitation, hygiene facilities. And if girls don't have access to that in school, they are going to drop out. And that is something, that of course, multitude of people are working on, but we still have a ways to go on that.
You're also a big proponent of advocacy, which you earlier, I remember you said it was a skill that you learned about when you were studying, right? Could you talk about the importance of advocacy and how you've included that in your life?
So when I went back to grad school, I was a single parent at that point, and I had just gotten out of a domestic violence situation. Now, in our society, there is a lot of stigma attached to somebody who's been through that situation, and unfortunately, much less stigma attached to a perpetrator of domestic violence. And at that point, I realized that I need to have this conversation with people that, I've been through this and I've been able to get out of this, because I want to destigmatize that piece. And that's something that I, actively worked on. But when I went to grad school in the US, that's when I met a friend and a neighbor. And, she told me that you have this story and you can discuss this and share this on different platforms where it can actually reach decision makers. And that is where you can actually make a difference with this at a systemic level. And that's when I realized, that there is a lot of power in reaching out to platforms that are there and then starting this conversation. And that became a very interesting piece of the work that I did throughout grad school. And very specifically, I focused on the support student parents needed to be successful, because unlike a lot of other students, if you are a primary caregiver, you need a lot more support to be successful. And there were a lot of forums, for example, student government, there were advisory roles, there were legislative sessions where I went and talked about my experiences of my community, and also presenting solutions. So I think a big piece of advocacy is also trying to figure out solutions and the low-hanging fruit, at least, that can be brought in to help people. And that really was a really great learning experience for me in terms of, not just thinking about representation and sharing your experiences, but also thinking about sitting down with decision makers and working on solutions that can help alleviate some of those challenges.
Right. So, locally in Pakistan, let's just talk about Pakistan. If someone wants to, represent themselves or a community that they really care for, what are the tools available to elevate the voices? If you could share some of those for people.
So I think that's a great question. And I don't feel that there is a straightforward answer, simply because everybody has access to a very different set of tools, right? So for somebody like me, because I work in the public sector, right? I have an office and I have access to decision makers. For me, it is easier to share my perspective or, take my analyses and talk to people and give them my opinion on this. However, for somebody who does not have this level of access, which happens to be most people in Pakistan, especially when you talk about marginalized communities, this is much more challenging. And in that particular case, I think, so one example I can give you is for enrollment in schools, we've recently worked on community mobilization. So engaging parents and community members to bring children back to school. And that sort of does give people at the local community level a platform to go talk to and engage with the people in the community who can actually take this message forward, who are, let's say, elected representatives or community notables, who can then, carry this forward. Again, that's not easy and that's not accessible to everybody. But again, it really does depend on the tools that you have access to. I mean, social media is great, but if you look at internet penetration in Punjab, you'll see that it is about 40%, right? So again, this is a challenge where you are very much tied by what you have access to.
Farah, before we wind it all up, I kind of want to know what is on your agenda, your to-do list for the near future.
So I have a lot of things that I want to work on. One of the things that I'm really passionate about, and goes back to why girls drop out of school, is doing a pilot for positive menstrual hygiene management in public schools. I fully intend to loop you into that effort as well. And then in terms of my work, so because I look at data pipelines, data systems, one of the things that I've realized is that education needs a lot of resources, right? Public education especially, but being in a developing country, we don't have enough resources to tackle everything. A maxim that I picked up was, in a budget document really reflects your priorities. And you can have anything you want, you just can't have everything you want. And so what I'm working towards is, supporting data-driven interventions, right? When you have limited resources, you really need to target them well. And you need to design interventions based on the data that you have. So that's something that I do in terms of my work, and I'm trying to make that more efficient and easier to do. So that's definitely on my to-do list. And I think one of the things on my to-do list has been for the past couple of years to travel. I really miss that. And even more than that, I really am looking forward to when full strength comes back to schools, because I want to go back to, engaging with young kids and talking about STEM careers and doing mentorship activities that I was doing till a couple of years ago. So I really am looking forward to us getting back there.
That really sounds great. And I do wish to stay in touch with you pertaining to all the projects that you're working on, and hopefully we can work together in the future. But till then, I wish you all the best with everything you're doing, and you're doing a great job. Thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. It was a very informative session.
Thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
Of course. I'll be in touch with you. Thank you, Farah.